Hi everyone, I'm Val and this is a video about Pokemon. I was first introduced to Pokemon during Gen 4. I actually remember drawing quite a few of my own Pokemon. This was, however, only to the limit of my 11-year-old artistic ability, and considering I didn't know very much about Pokemon Origins at the time, they were kind of just different coloured cats, which, while I'm sure would fly in some places, isn't really what I'm going for. Recently, as a creative exercise, I decided to create Pokemon for type combos that were completely unused. I went to a page that had a list of all the unused type combinations after Gen 8. Some of these type combos are technically used by legendaries or mega evolutions, but they're rare enough that I thought I could get away with them, and honestly some of the type combos were too interesting for me to not use. I ended up picking these 8 type combos. Let's see what I came up with. So first up we have a fire and grass Pokemon. I had quite a few ideas for this one, ranging from a campfire to just a little torch with a ball on top, but in the end I kind of thought about tiki torches, and then I decided to make a tiki statue with the actual Pokemon hiding inside. When I started drawing this, I tried to make it as generic as I could. I'm not really versed enough in the imagery of these cultures to create something meaningful, so I wanted something that just kind of evoked the idea of a tiki statue without going too far into it. Normally I'd like to do something a bit more researched, and we will see that later. Once we've tidied up the line art and we have a very, very evil looking Tiki, I decided to draw the little flame inside. I wanted this to be the actual Pokemon that's just taken refuge in some local culture's Tiki torches. He looks an awful lot like Calcifer from Howl's Moving Castle, which I'm absolutely fine with. I did toy with making the Tiki look a bit more like Demon Calcifer and then have the baby Calcifer on the inside, but I honestly don't think that would have worked as well. Now, as I was colouring, I got into an argument with my bucket tool because I've been using Clip Studio Paint for about 6 months and still don't understand how it works. In terms of actual colours, I ended up using colours that were very similar to Aku Aku because that's what he basically looks like. I then kind of coloured the fire in pretty lazily. This isn't how I normally shade fire, but I needed it to look kind of Pokemon and flat rather than the weird fire effect that I usually do. I wasn't really sure how to get his eyes look like they were glowing without looking too creepy. I think I managed to hit a nice middle ground here, and he looks like a little friendly guy hugging the lip of the Tiki torch as he waves to you. The Tiki looks intimidating, but that's exactly why this little guy chose it. He can intimidate anyone who tries to move or evict him from his home, but really he'll hang out and you can cook marshmallows on him as long as he gets to eat some. Next we have our poison and steel type. I had the idea of an armoured snake with a blade on its tail. I sketched out the rough shape of the body and then proceeded to have a very hard time drawing a snake head. You wouldn't have thought it was so difficult, but I spent so long trying to get it right I gave up, moved on to the body, and then came back. I start trying to put some armour on his face here. I thought it would be kind of cool if he looked like he was wearing a knight helmet, so I added this jaw piece. I then mess around with how much it would wrap around his head. I even try and give him a little samurai ponytail at one point, but I decide I don't like it and it immediately goes. Now the idea with this Pokemon is that it's actually really noble and fiercely loyal. It was a servant for Pokemon kings in ancient times. In fact, you can see protective sculptures of it all over the palaces of the region where it originates. I decided that its bottom part of its tail would be completely armour plated. That's why it kind of descends in these steps, because the actual tail stopped before that. I obviously made this whole snake purple because you can't have a poison type without it being purple. I did make sure that the metal had a very lilac tint to it, and that was only brought out by the shading. Now once I was done with this, I had an idea for the baby form, so I did a quick doodle of it. It's basically a tiny little baby snake coming out of an egg of the same metal that it eventually uses for its armour. As it grows, it finds more metal to add to itself, until it becomes its fully evolved and completely armoured form, ready to serve the next king. The interesting thing is that this Pokemon would actually be immune to most of the moves it could learn. It must have been very interesting watching 2 of these Pokemon fight to protect their masters. Next up we have a Psychic and Ghost type Pokemon. My first idea was some kind of witchcraft Pokemon, and you can see me mess around with this idea, with this strange atom of a crystal ball surrounded by runes and tarot cards. I wasn't a massive fan of this idea, but I kept going until I drew that bandana and I had a much better idea. I kept the crystal ball as I liked that as a focus point of the design, but rather than having the bandana wrapped around the crystal ball, I had the idea that the bandana was the arms that it used to interact with the world. So I drew this strip of fabric that was tied together at the bottom, and then it had two arms that would come up, and the edges would kind of bend to create fingers as it was casting its spells. Now when it came to colour, I knew I wanted blue and purple in there. I wasn't sure which way round I wanted it, but I tried both and decided that I liked the purple in the orb and the little rune more. So after I did my basic shading, I added an extra swirl inside to make it look like the spirit was roaming around inside the crystal ball. The face did look a bit too creepy in the smoke for a while, so I made it a bit more matte on top of the ball rather than inside it. I made sure the rune on the spell matches Stone Jewelner for continuity. I'm pretty sure this is the rune of Frere or fertility, not the rune of abundance, which I've seen some people think of it as. It might just be a handwriting thing though, because I don't think any rune is actually drawn that way. Okay, so now we have the ground fairy type. I honestly thought I was going to have way better ideas for this one when I first picked the type combination, some kind of dust sprite or tornado spirit, but in the end I settled on this strange little pink bunny rabbit with fairy wings for ears that wraps itself in dust and fibre particles that it finds lying around. It spends most of its time sleeping, saving up energy for it to evolve into its bigger form, but apparently if you manage to get the little blanket off of it, it's incredibly soft and warm, but it's also kind of gross because it's full of dirt particles. Yeah, this is basically just a really bad pun on the term dust bunny, and I have no regrets, but also, I feel like I could have been way more creative than this than I was, and I'm just not a massive fan of it. So now we have ice and poison. I didn't really want to draw another snake for a poison type, so I started looking up venomous animals with the idea that I'd probably end up doing some kind of like jellyfish or something, but it turns out that shrews are venomous, which is pretty surprising and weird, but okay. We don't really have that many mammalian poison types either, so I thought it would be a really neat idea. I spent a very long time trying to figure out what shrews look like and how to draw them. After spending about 5 minutes googling different pictures of shrews, I came up with this really cute little pose where he's kind of raised up his back legs like he's saying, "Hello, I am tiny, love me." I think this Pokemon's pretty precious. He spends most of his time burrowing around in the snow in the towns where he lives. In fact, he manages to hide himself so well that sometimes people will pick him up when they're having snowball fights and throw him at the opponent. At that point, he will probably bite the person that he's thrown at before he manages to run away. Luckily, his venom is only slightly irritating to humans, so it's not that bad if you get bitten by him. Kind of like if you get stung by a bee and you're not allergic to bee stings. In terms of colour palette, I did keep him pretty cool because he's an ice type after all. I decided to go with a really nice icy blue fur rather than the white fur that you see on most ice types because I thought it was a bit more interesting. The skin parts are a much darker blue to reflect how chilly he is. I did make his eyes entirely purple. I wasn't sure if it was going to be too creepy until I shaded it and I brought that little life into his eyes. I really like this little guy. I think he'd make a good pet. Next up we have fire and water. I'll be honest, I always thought Torkoal was a fire and water type because of its artwork, so my first thought was some kind of teapot turtle, but I've seen quite a few people do that before. Instead, I started thinking about this amazing villager that moved into my town recently, and she's basically an elephant, but she's also a teapot. I really love her and I thought that was a great idea. I know we just had an elephant Pokemon in Galar, but I really like this idea, so I'm going with it. After drawing a simple baby elephant and giving it some markings that look like they belong on a ceramic teapot, I was essentially done. I decided that his ears would have holes so that they looked more like handles. Don't ask me how he hears through them because it's a Pokemon and the answer is magic. I also gave him a much flatter tail. The idea is that he uses the tail to fan the flames inside him so that the water in his trunk will steam out and boil. This Pokemon's very social and can often be found in people's homes warming their water for them. After giving him a little smoke puff coming out of his trunk, I decided that I wanted to represent the fire type a bit more, so I drew some little flames on his back and his head, the idea being that he has holes that he can shoot fire out of. This does help him attack, but it's also used for people to put plates on to keep food warm. Now, I studied archaeology at university, so naturally my first thought when I heard rock and ghost Pokemon was a haunted stone tablet. We already have Runerigas for the haunted picture tablet, so I thought why not use my expertise to do a haunted writing tablet. I just drew some basic clay tablet shapes in a reed stylus. The idea here is that the Pokemon is actually the entity using the stylus and the tablets, not the items themselves. This Pokemon is unbelievably ancient, and because it can't be seen by others, it writes to communicate with the people and Pokemon that it finds. Unfortunately, it's so old that it can only write in a script that no one reads anymore, so it perpetually wanders around writing to people, trying to be noticed. There are a few scholars that can communicate with them. Unfortunately, these Pokemon don't find the scholars very interesting, and therefore will leave to try and find someone more fun to interact with. I know it's a bit sadder than some of the other Pokemon that I've drawn, but that's kind of what happens with Ghost Pokemon. I mean, Yamask carries around its own death mask, crying out loud. It looks at its face and cries. So the big writing on the tablet is actually the sign for Nabu, the god of writing, which I thought was funny because I'm a giant Assyriology nerd. I decided to draw an aura that was kind of holding up the tablets and wrapping around the stylus to write. Rather than make it the purple that you'd normally associate with ghost types, I made it really bright blue to reflect lapis lazuli. This is a stone that has a lot of spiritual power in most cultures, particularly Mesopotamia, which I'm going to stop because otherwise I'm going to go on about my favourite piece of Akkadian literature, which nobody wants to hear about. And last up we have a bug dark type Pokemon. This was actually surprisingly difficult to come up with an appropriate bug. My first thought was of a funnel web spider, but I couldn't really translate that into a Pokemon very easily. I thought some more about bugs that lie in wait until they can strike their prey, and then I realised that there's such a thing as the orchid mantis, but I don't really like orchids, so I decided to make a tulip mantis because I like tulips. I decided that it would form the tulip shape by having a membrane on the inside of its legs. When it perches in its hunting stance, the legs fold up and create a kind of petal shape, and the back end of the bug creates the part on the inside that other bug-type Pokemon will come along and think they're going to get a snack, and then they get, they become the snack. I had to spend some time in the line art phase getting the legs to look right because I just drew a bunch of sticks and didn't actually think about how they connected to the body, so his very back pair of legs don't actually connect in my first draft, and I had to just kind of jimmy it to make it at least look like he doesn't have some weird floating legs. When it came to colours, I knew I wanted the tulip petals to be red, the inside to be yellow, and the rest of the bug to be quite a dark colour to reflect the dark type. I spent a while messing around with the proportions, and eventually I decided to change the black or grey to a very dark green, because I thought it would be quite obvious if there's a black spot on a leaf that you probably don't want to go near it, but if there's a slightly darker green spot on a leaf, then you're probably not going to think too much of it, and that's exactly what this Pokemon wants because it wants to munch you. And there we have it. We have 8 Pokemon with either unused or legendary only type combinations. I'm really proud of these. I think the 2 ghost type Pokemon and the little poison shrew are my favourite. I really like that I was able to come up with a proper design inspiration for most of these rather than just taking my cat and making her blue. I don't really have any names for these, any ideas of stat distributions or abilities. I just wanted to think of their inspiration and a little bit of lore behind them because that's honestly what I think is the best about Pokemon. I'm not that into the kind of gameplay or meta, so I don't really care what abilities they have. You let me know what you think these abilities these Pokemon would have. I've done my part. I've come up with their personalities. I don't care anymore. But that's all I've got to say for now. I've had a really fun time and I hope to see you again, so bye pals.